to say what she had planned to say. First of all, I think that this is the first of a series of webinar, and it is quite timely to organize this type of webinar, bringing together the different communities. One of the component of the Global Biodiversity Framework is the monitoring framework, which they will allow basically the monitoring of the achievement in on the targets and goals that are being discussed as part of the Global Monitoring Framework, and we'll hear more from the CBD in this context. One key feature, I would say, of this time is that there are many communities that are being involved, which are not usually part of... Oh, Anne.
Ah, yes. Hello.
Oh, I'll pass it on to our chair. Great, you could join.
No, continue, please, because I'm still with the help desk for a few minutes.
Okay. No, I was just giving a brief introduction that, I mean, we have the statistical community that actually for the first time is being directly involved in the development and then also in the implementation of the indicators. And I think that this is a major achievement, I would say, from the statistical community. And we also have the geospatial and in particular the GEO BON community that will be presenting today, which will be presenting their achievement in helping to support the implementation of the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework. We think that it's that these discussions, especially at the country level, between these different communities, the statistical communities, the parties, and the scientific community, should really be fostered and developed over the starting from now, I would say, and to discuss the monitoring framework more in detail. I'm not sure, Anne, are you with us now?
Yes.
Okay.
I hope so, because we had problems here with the network of the Commission. But yeah, so I try to catch up.
Yes, over to you.
So we are now starting with the presentations.
Yeah, unless you want to say a few words, you can have a few minutes and then we can start with the presentations.
Okay, so thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, sorry. It depends where you are, basically. For us, it's good afternoon. For you, for some of you, it's good morning. So I'm very, very happy to be able to facilitate this seminar. We believe it's a very important step forward to be able to involve all the work of UNSD, GEO BON, and others to monitor progress on the future commitments which will be taken by the parties in the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So for the first time, the global targets and goals which will be adopted will have to be monitored by parties using a set of headline indicators. And so that will be a bit like for climate policy, where all parties will have to show their contribution to globally agreed commitments. This is very important also for the citizens to see that we are serious about the actions to be taken and the objective that we are fixing. But it also implies, because the framework is so broad, that we work in a very streamlined way and use the best available standards and also indicators to do so and involve a wider community than the biodiversity community. So for this today, so we will hear some very important presentations from the Secretariat of the CBD and from GEO BON and UNEP-WCMC, who are all instrumental in the development of this monitoring framework. So I'm really looking forward to listening to all of them and also to your questions. So if I don't know if you have already given the housekeeping announcement, Alessandra, that the meeting is recorded. So we would like to record the meeting because it will help us also for the report. And what we are proposing to do is to have the presentations, and then after the presentation, if you wish to ask a question, you just put a message in the chat, and my colleagues and we will try to monitor the chat, and so bring the questions into the discussions during the discussion session. So finally, if you have technical problems, as I did, then with Zoom or whatever, then please put a message in the chat. And so UNSD has a team to help you, Jessica Chang and Elsa Benier, who can provide support online. So I hope everything will be fine from now on. So with this, if there is no question, Jillian, you have the floor to give an overview of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just in terms of how today's going to be structured before I get started, I'm going to give a very introductory overview to the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and how it's going to be monitored. A more detailed presentations will be given by Natasha and Alessandra and Mike. So just in terms of the flow of information, in case I haven't said enough, I believe that others will say a lot more, and so hopefully that will answer the questions as we go on. So with that, next slide. Oh, and I can also introduce myself quickly. My name is Jillian Campbell. I'm the head of monitoring, review, and reporting at the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat. And one of the things that we are working on right now, of course, is the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and how we're going to measure it. And so the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF as we're calling it for short, will be adopted at the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity as a stepping stone towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. So this is a new iteration of the IACHI framework, if you were familiar with that, which has expired in 2020. And so this is the new vision for the next 30 years with 10-year targets. Next slide. So the logic of the GBF is that at the goal level, there are 4 goals that try to capture where we want to be in terms of biodiversity. And so what I mean here by state is not the state in terms of the system of environmental economic accounts or measuring state, if you're familiar with statistics, but just the state of the planet. So where is the world in terms of our ecosystem extent? Where are we in terms of species? Where are we in terms of how people benefit from nature? And where do we want to be? And so these 4 goals really set the framework for where we want to be in 2050. So how do we get to the planet that we want? And so these goals are, as I said, more related to the actual environment around us and not how we get there. Whereas then there's 20 targets right now in the current GBF, and these are how do we get to those goals. So it might be policy, it might be improving sustainable consumption and production, it might be reducing pollution. There are different actions that can be taken, and that's what the targets aim to set out. And the idea here behind the Global Biodiversity Framework is that if we work towards these targets and achieve the targets, then the goals will be the benefit that we see from the achievement of the targets. And this is a shift from the IACHI, as I mentioned, which maybe some of you are familiar with, where the IACHI included only targets, and it was a bit of a mix of where we want to be versus what the actions are. Another shift, of course, is that the goals go to 2050, so they're longer term than in the previous framework. Next slide. So from my perspective, as the person who's working on the monitoring, review, and reporting side, another big change in the new framework is that the monitoring framework is going to be officially part of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So with the IACHI, there were indicators, but these indicators were developed much later than when the framework itself was developed. And they were developed by a group of international agencies without really going through a political process. And so they were never adopted, and they were used on an ad hoc basis by countries. So they weren't really consistently used in national reporting. Whereas with the new GBF, I think partially learning from the SDG process, there will be a set of indicators for the Global Biodiversity Framework that is adopted alongside of the goals and targets. And so the indicators will be more official. And here's the link to the current draft, although I will say it's being revised, and a new draft of both the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Monitoring Framework will be released in the next 2 weeks. So you might want to keep checking the website if you're interested to see how it's going to change. And they're just similar to the SDGs, there is this need to sort of balance aspiration and feasibility. So much scoping has been done in terms of what indicators exist, and Natasha will definitely talk about this after me, and which indicators are ready to use. However, as we've been working to develop the monitoring framework, it's important to include not only indicators that are ready to use, but it's important to ensure that we're actually measuring what we want to measure and what the targets and the goals are about. And so if an indicator does not exist, then the framework does include indicators to be developed, or areas where we can already leverage initiatives that are developing indicators that could be then used. And I think both Alessandra and Mike will talk about this. Obviously, in order to balance the aspiration and the feasibility, we have been trying to use existing national methodologies, such as the SEEA, which is a UN agreed framework for measuring environmental economic accounts. Next slide. So I just quickly want to tell you the structure of the monitoring framework. We have a set of headline indicators. The headline indicators are the indicators that are the highest level. They match with the overall scope of the goals and the targets. So they're not going into so much detail, but they aim to cover a very broad topic. An example of one of the headline indicators that's in there is natural ecosystem extent. So you can see this covers a whole range of ecosystems, and it is aiming to do sort of a composite indicator of measuring across different ecosystem types in order to understand what's natural. And so this would be natural ecosystem extent for both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. The framework does, of course, also capture the marine ecosystems. And so these headline indicators, the idea behind them is that they would be used in national reporting processes. And I will also then say that the national reporting processes are mandatory under the convention. And so it's not necessarily that the use of these indicators will be mandatory, but it will be part of the template probably for national reporting, and the national reporting itself is mandatory. And so in order to operationalize this, it would be important to have indicators that can be rolled out, nationalized, and tailored at the national level to ensure that they're not only useful for these national reporting processes, which would come back to the Secretariat for global aggregation and analysis by the countries themselves, but obviously it's important that these indicators are also useful for national policy, so that they have these dual purposes, so that the countries really get the most out of developing these indicators. And we're also looking to identify global data sets, which can be used to fill any data gaps, and also for countries that would like to use something that's ready-made. They could use an indicator that's based on satellite data or other global models. Then we have two other levels of indicators in the framework: the component indicators, which are more detailed than the headline indicators and aim to capture different aspects of a goal or target. As I gave the example of ecosystem extent, an example of a component indicator that's linked to ecosystem extent would be the wetland extent and the mangrove extent and the forest extent. And so it's a disaggregation actually in that case of the natural ecosystem extent. Mom, can I do this outside? And then we also have complementary indicators, which are useful for more depth analysis. Yes. And so that's the framework that we have. Okay, next slide. Can I do this outside, Mom? So with that, I'm going to hand over and let other people give you more details on the framework. And then I'm happy to come back for any questions. I do want to say again that, as I mentioned, the indicators are being revised in the next couple weeks. They will still need to go through a political process, and this is still something that's very much ongoing. But we do expect to have indicators adopted later this year, along with the Global Biodiversity Framework. And then what we will see is trying to really operationalize these at the national level. So over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Jillian. So hi, everybody. I'm Natasha Ali. I'm from UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre, UNEP-WCMC. And in this section of the webinar, I'm going to highlight some of the work that UNEP-WCMC and its partners undertakes in relation to analysis and assessment of those indicators that Jillian has been describing, and some of the tools that could potentially be of use to parties in monitoring and reporting of progress towards the post-2020 framework. Just a bit of background, UNEP-WCMC is the specialist biodiversity assessment arm of UNEP, and it plays a key role in providing information about indicators, including through its role as providing the Secretariat to the BIP. And the BIP, for those of you that don't know, is the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, and it's a global initiative of around 70 partners that work to promote and coordinate the development and delivery of biodiversity indicators, and it's mandated to provide information on the post-2020 framework through decisions of the COP. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to highlight in this section is, as Jillian has been describing, there's quite a lot of information that is proposed in the monitoring framework in relation to indicators. So there are many indicators proposed in that monitoring framework, and discussions at the recent meetings of the subsidiary bodies on scientific, technical and technological advice, and that of the body on implementation, SBI and SBSTA, have highlighted that parties have lots of questions about the indicators therein proposed. So organisations like UNEP-WCMC, working in partnership with many others, have providing as much information as we can about the indicators that are proposed. And where there are indicators that we know about, we can share that information. And where there are gaps in the framework or information that indicators that are less developed, then we work with partners to think about how we might meet the gaps and measure what we want to measure in relation to those proposed goals and targets. So I'm going to talk about the sort of work that we've done to assess the availability and suitability of the indicators that are proposed. And this relates to the work that we undertook last year, and it was summarised in an information document, INF document 16 to Substa 24, which is available as a link in this presentation. And then I'll also highlight the work that we're doing in partnership with NatureServe, GEO BON and the EU Joint Research Centre to make this information about indicators accessible online so that parties can access links of indicators through the website. Thanks, next slide. So in relation to the work that we undertook last year, this was in response to recommendation from Substa 23, which asks to the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership and OECD and other partners to respond to the peer review of the papers around indicators that were put forward for that meeting, and also a peer review of the zero draft of the monitoring framework for the post-2020 framework, so the goals and targets and the indicators proposed. And that peer review process solicited an enormous response, and I won't sort of read out the numbers there that are on the slide. Essentially, there was a large response of information that was provided, including over 5,000 pieces of information about the proposed indicators and gaps in the framework. So what UNEP-WCMC and its partners did, next slide please, was undertake an assessment of the information and of those indicators proposed in the zero draft framework. And we looked at a couple of things. We looked at the alignment of those indicators. So we were asking the question of how well does a proposed indicator align to the text of the goal or the target in that post-2020 framework, in the zero draft. And then we looked at the temporal relevance, so whether or not there were, how many times the indicator was updated throughout the period 2010 to 2020, so looking backwards at how frequently that indicator is up to date as a measure of how well it will perform in the future. And then we looked at spatial coverage, so how much of the world can be served by this indicator and how many countries and continents are covered by this indicator. Next slide, please. And from that analysis, we're enabled to sort of ranking where we scored some indicators as highly and some as less so. So high scoring indicators are those that are well aligned to the the element of the monitoring framework, the goal or the target, as defined by Tittensaw et al. And I should highlight that methodology has been used over 3 times to measure the effectiveness of indicators for the Aichi targets. And then those also high scoring indicators are those that have over 5 data points within the period 2010 to 2020. And those that have good spatial coverage, so they measure coverage they measure progress in over 20 countries or at least 5 continents. Whereas low scoring are the opposite, so less than 2 data points available, not very good alignment to the goal or the target, and coverage in less than 3 countries. Next slide. Oh, sorry. I should also highlight that there were some indicators for which we could not provide an analysis, so there weren't enough data points, or we could not validate the data around temporal relevance, or the indicator provider or information could not be found around the spatial coverage of a particular indicator. Thanks. Next slide. Just highlight some considerations about this sorts of analysis. So this is the sort of analysis that we're going to provide continuously throughout the negotiation period of the post-2020 framework. We should say that we only, in this analysis, undertook an assessment of the indicators that we know to the best of our knowledge and that are available now. So anything that is in development, we parked and we keep in a data set, and we are open to kind of other information about indicators that are in development. As we say, we're going to rerun this analysis so that we can keep informing the negotiation process around the development of the monitoring framework. It's also worth highlighting that some of the indicators we assessed appear a few times in the monitoring framework, and that's important perhaps for consideration by parties, because an indicator can be used a few times reduces the reporting burden for parties and those who are developing data sets around this. Next slide, please. So as I say, this analysis is available in INF document 16 to Substa 24, and it provides the analysis and an overview of what we did, as well as the list of 105 available indicators. And then we provide lists in various ways. So first of all, the indicators that are available for the zero draft by goal and by target. We also have an alphabetical list of those indicators that are proposed. And we also have a mapping, as Jillian described, of those high-level headline indicators against those that we know are available, so highlighting where the gaps are and where work needs to be done. Although this is all available in INFDoc, we're working closely with GEO BON and NatureServe, members of the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership and the EU Joint Research Centre, to make this available accessible online. So we'll be developing some online portals that show information about the indicators, including indicator metadata sheets, so that parties can download information about each of the indicators so they can know more about how they'll work in their context. Next slide, please. In this last slide, I just want to highlight some of the future potential options for parties in relation to the tools that might be used for monitoring and reporting towards the post-2020 framework. And I'm going to just give a few highlights here, but we're going to run a few more webinars on these tools that could be used by parties at a later date. I think October is the date that is planned. So in this schematic of available tools, some of the tools that might be of use to parties that showcase indicators are the UN Biodiversity Lab, which is a spatial planning tool that provides over 150 geospatial data sets on nature, climate, and others. And users can upload data and into secure workspaces, and they can analyse and visualise data and create their own maps. And this tool can be used for 6th national reporting, as Jillian highlighted, is a mandatory mechanism under the CBD. And the other tool that I'd like to highlight here is the Target Tracker, which we're developing in collaboration with NatureServe. And it's a platform that is going to enable parties to progress to the goals and targets of the post-2020 framework once it's adopted. So once that's adopted, the platform will show progress using those indicators towards the goals and targets, so we can all see where we are in relation to those goals and targets. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I guess I will give the floor to Alessandra Alfieri. Yes, Alessandra, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you. I'll just briefly speak about on the SEEA EA, how the work came about, how actually we are structured, and now we function within the statistical community. And I'll try to say a few words on what the SEEA is in short time, and how it can support the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So this whole discussion actually on the need to account for nature better, and to the fact that GDP does not really reflect the welfare or the well-being of a nation, came about in the 70s. And that's when actually the discussion on developing a system that would better include the nature and would better account for the contribution of nature to the economy and to well-being started. So the system of environmental economic accounting, actually the first document was developed in 1993. And actually was mentioned in the agenda, in the 1992 Agenda for Sustainable Development in Chapter 8, which called countries for the implementation of the SEEA. Since then, there has been many development which really aim to better integrate nature into the economy and well-being. And next. So how are we organized? So there is a committee of experts on environmental economic accounting, which was established in 2005. And basically it is an intergovernmental body formed by countries and international agencies with the objective of provide overall vision, coordination and prioritization to environmental economic accounting. And one actually of the main objective was to elevate the SEA to the level of international statistical standard, which actually now has been achieved, and to mainstream environmental economic accounting and supporting statistics within the national statistical system, but also promote its use in supporting policy, and of course advance country implementation. So the Committee of Experts on Environmental Economic Accounting sits under the Statistical Commission, which is the body of ECOSOC formed by heads of all national statistical offices, which basically decides on standards, for example, the system of national accounts, the censuses, the methodology for censuses, for social statistics, and so on. So the Committee of Experts on Environmental Economic Accounting is responsible for the environmental economy interaction. So, and then within this, the committee, we have 4 separate groups which deal with the specific aspects: coordination, methodological development, development of database, and the implementation and statistical capacity building. So the SEA ecosystem accounts, which was recently adopted in 2021, was the result of the work of the methodological development, in particular on the area on ecosystem accounts, which was led by Anton Steurer of Eurostat. We also have the Sca Central Framework, which was actually adopted as an international statistical standard in 2012. And we have a number of thematic handbooks which address specific issues related, for example, energy, water, measuring sustainable tourism, and ocean, which basically try to build a bridge between the specific subject areas and the accounting world. So trying to develop a common language and a common terminology between these different aspects. So here we have the system of national accounts, which is basically the standard to measure economic statistics. And then now at the same level, we have the system of environmental economic accounting, which basically consists of 2 volumes. Now we have the SEA Central Framework and the SEA Ecosystem Accounts, which basically measure the relationship between the economy and the environment from 2 different perspectives, with the central framework focusing on the economy and how the economy uses the environment in terms of resource use, extraction, and the use within the economy, and returning back to the environment in terms of emissions and waste, and the ecosystem accounts, which looks at the perspective of the ecosystem. And then we have the subsystem that I mentioned before. Next. So the SEA implementation, one of the SDG indicator actually is the number of countries implementing the SEA. And so we run every year a global assessment to basically track the implementation, the global implementation. So we have now 89 countries that are implementing the SEA Central Framework and 34 countries that are implementing the SEA ecosystem accounts, with 27 countries planning to start the implementation. And here, if you see, I mean, the blue, the different shades of blue represent different stages of implementation, running from, let's say, a one-off type of exercise within the last 5 years to a full implementation integrated within the statistical production process. And I mean, as you see in Africa, there is a lot of we do not have a lot of data, but there is a big effort now moving towards implementation, in particular in Africa. Next. So the SEA Conceptual Framework, basically the idea is that we have the economy sits within the environment, and within the economy we measure the different activities that are carried out by the different units, which can be households, businesses, households, or government. And also we measure all the different economic instruments, like related to the environment, like for example, environmental taxes, environmental subsidies, and so on. And we look at the relationship between the economy and the environment in terms of natural resource inputs, like timber or water or mineral energy resources, and also the return in terms of residuals, in terms of emission and waste. And then what we do with the ecosystem accounts, actually, we look at the ecosystems as a spatial unit. So the difference is really taking a spatial approach and measuring the the condition of the ecosystem and the ecosystem services that are provided to the economy and to the humans more generally. So the core accounts of the SEA ecosystem accounts, so we have the ecosystem extent and condition, which represent the stocks. So this is the ecosystem asset, and of course they are spatially explicit. And then we have the ecosystem service flow, and then the in physical and in monetary terms, and then the monetary ecosystem assets. So basically, this is kind of the sequence in which the accounts are usually compiled. We start with the physical accounts of ecosystem extent and condition, and then we measure the flows, first in physical and in monetary terms, which then allows to compile the compilation of the asset. So in 2021, so last March, the Statistical Commission adopted the SEA ecosystem accounts. I mean, for those of you who know, the first ecosystem accounts was actually published in 2013 with the title experimental. Now it was agreed to drop the experimental from the title, and chapter 1 to 7, which describe the accounting framework and the physical accounts, were adopted as a statistical standard. And chapter 8 to 11, which describe the monetary valuation, were recognized as internationally recognized statistical principles recommendation for valuation of ecosystem services and assets. This is a little bit of a mouthful, basically to say that this is not at the same level of chapters 1 to 7 of the physical accounts, but there is enough advancement and enough agreement from a conceptual point of view to recommend actually the implementation. And then chapter 12 and 14, which actually describe the link between the exchange values, which is the valuation concepts used in the SEA EA, which is consistent with the national accounts. The chapter on indicator and the chapter on thematic accounts are basically describing applications and extension. And there is one chapter on indicators which really elaborates a little bit more on the link between the SEA and the monitoring framework. One important thing also that the Commission decided is to really recommended the UNCEA to really scale up the implementation of the SEA ecosystem accounts. Next. So this is a little the structure of the SEA EA I have already mentioned. In addition to the SEA EA, we are also working now on an implementation strategy, which will be brought to the Statistical Commission at the next session. We are also working on supporting materials that will facilitate the implementation at the national level. So there are the guidelines of biophysical modeling, there are guidelines of valuation, and guidelines on scenario analysis. And also we are updating, we have an e-learning on the SEA ecosystem accounts, we are updating this e-learning. And then we just launched in April the areas for SEA Explorer, which will allow to compile some of these accounts using global data sets, Earth observation and models. So it's based basically on the interoperability of models and data. And will support also the compilation of the indicators. So why the SEEA? So basically, we say we use always this hashtag makes nature count. And the idea is really to try to make explicit things that until now have not been really measured on a regular and consistent basis, and make them used in economic planning and decision making. Standardization is important. It is a way to obtain high quality data and comparable statistics over time, but it also gives a certain level of confidence of the information that is being developed. The SEEA since it is an integrated framework, it catalyzes collaboration between different stakeholders. So when we implement the SEEA in countries, it is usually very much a multi-stakeholder collaboration with national statistical offices, universities, line ministries, and businesses. And this is also in line with the kind of change figure of the National Statistical Office, which now is increasingly becoming a data steward and trying to basically build on and leverage the expertise that exists in different ministries or in academia, and increasingly also working much closer with businesses. And also the SEEA provides a framework for deriving indicators that can support various monitoring frameworks. So the whole idea is to develop a statistical system which then will allow to compile different indicators to support users' needs. Another thing to mention from the Statistical Commission, they very much encouraged the statistical community to engage in the development and implementation of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And they actually were quite excited that the statistical community was actually asked to participate in this process from the outset. Next. So also in Substa 24, I think that the document recognizes that the SEEA has a value and and basically has to be considered in mainstreaming biodiversity national statistical system and strengthen national information and monitoring system and reporting. So it's quite important that the SEEA be considered as part of the underlying framework also for some of these headline indicators. So SEEA and Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, so we have done some kind of a preliminary analysis, and there are a number of indicators that can be derived from the SEEA accounts. And there would need to be some adjustments in some of these indicators, but I think that the methodology is quite consistent with the SEEA ecosystem accounts. And here is an example, which of course we would need to update when the indicators will be updated and eventually adopted. So just by way of example, to say that the countries are actually implementing this, the Brazil has compiled ecosystem extent accounts from the 2000 to 2018. And this basically supports the headline indicator on extent of selected natural ecosystem. And yeah, and the natural ecosystems here are defined as forest, savanna and grassland, wetland, mangroves, salt marshes, coral reefs, seagrass, and macroalgae and intertidal habitats. Next. And this is an example of the GEP, which is related to Goal B of the monitoring framework, developed for the for 2 provinces. This is the case of Guangxi in China. Basically they have monitored, they have measured the ecosystem services, the 3rd level ecosystem services, and valued them. And basically the total of the value of the ecosystem services is what it's considered the GEP. The numbers actually are quite high with respect to the percentage of GDP. This is still, the figures are still experimental, but there is quite a bit of effort in trying to measure and value ecosystem services in a consistent way, which is coherent with the system of environmental economic accounts. And in China now, the National Bureau of Statistics has received the mandate to develop methodology and roll out implementation by 2025 of the GEP. So the next steps, what we will what we will do, we have now a group on indicators under the committee, under the UNCEA, and the idea is to develop a document which will explain the relationship between the SEA ecosystem accounts with the Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework to the open-ended working group. We will also work on developing metadata for those indicators that are related to in particular Goal A and Goal B that can be derived from the SEA ecosystem accounts. And next, we are also working with these areas for SEA, and this also again will be presented in October as one of the tools, which will allow to compile some of those indicators using global customizable models and Earth observation data. And it can be also, the global data sets can actually be improved using national data sets and obtain the national estimates using this, the customizable models. And the whole idea here is based on what I mentioned before on this interoperability of data and models, and we are actually working increasingly with different data producers and modelers to to basically develop this collaboration and to be able to increasingly compile these accounts on a regular basis. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I would like to give the floor to the last presentation for today from GEO BON. So I give the floor to Andrew and Mike. I think it's a duet, is it?
That's correct, Anne. Thank you very much. This will be a duet.
Thank you.
My name is Andrew Gonzalez. I am the co-chair of GEO BON, and I will be joined today by Mike Gill, who is the exiting co-chair of GEO BON and has served GEO BON over the last 6 years in that role. So GEO BON is a flagship of GEO, which is the group on Earth observations. And the best description of GEO BON is a large network of researchers and practitioners working on a common or shared goal of acquiring, coordinating and delivering biodiversity observations and the indicators that are built from those observations that we need for this for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So you see here a map of where people who are part of GEO BON live and work. There are more than 1,700 registered members. Yes, next slide. From all around the world, and it's open and free network to be part of. And when you visit the site, you can see all sorts of statistics of what this community is doing and where it is working. And we can see from the lower right here that in this pie chart that there are GEO BON members working all over the world, different regions, different continents, different countries. And it's important to point out that we have many hundreds of partner institutions, and we're going to come back to that at the end. But this is not just a set of academics working towards best practices. It's really a user-driven best application of the knowledge that we have around biodiversity observation and how we generate indicators built for purpose of monitoring our progress towards the targets and goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide. What is our mission? Well, as I just said, it's about improving, creating a quantum leap, if you like, in the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observations. That it means providing guidance to the parties so that they can quickly identify appropriate indicators for the different targets that Jillian spoke to at the beginning, whether that's headline, component, or detailed indicators. Crucially, providing access to user-friendly and open indicator methodologies. These things are often hard to do, they're not easy to access, and we want to make that very easy to access. And third, providing guidance for the sustained production, delivery, and use of biodiversity indicators. So that requires establishing, thank you very much. Thank you, yeah, next slide. That requires combining two facets of what GEO BON delivers. The first of these is what's called a family of EBVs, or essential biodiversity variables. And they are derived from what we call the engines of biodiversity observations. These are the biodiversity observation networks, the bonds, that are typically placed in space to have a geographic structure to them, whether that's national or regional. But there also exists a family of thematic bonds, for example, freshwater, marine, soil, etc., that are very cross-cutting and allow us to cross geographic boundaries. And all of this we see is supported by a biodiversity observation community, whether that's in situ on the ground collecting data, or remote sensing from space or from aircraft. And together these observations work into our EBV development process, standardization process, via the design and endorsement of bonds to create a complete solution that parties need to assess their progress towards the goals and targets. And this is an iterative process that we're improving over time. Next slide. So what is an essential biodiversity variable? Well, to put it bluntly, it's a minimum set of measurements that are complementary to each other and that capture the different dimensions of biodiversity change, right? It's clear that biodiversity change means many things, whether it's genetic diversity change, population abundances, occurrences, the structure of the ecological communities that make up the ecosystems and the processes that ecosystems perform. Here you're seeing a set of icons across the biodiversity hierarchy from genes to ecosystems. GEO BON proposes an EBV for each level and has had working groups developing the methodologies to ensure that they are biological and policy relevant. That combination is what makes them essential, that they are sensitive to change, that they're rigorous and robust, that they are state variables that can be aggregated and disaggregated in smart ways that allow us to make them scalable, that they're generalizable across biomes and realms, and then of course that they're feasible, meaning that they are that we have data for them, that we have methodologies for transforming those data into statistical indicators, and that they can be readily applied in a national reporting process. Next slide. A quick advertisement here to show that we have an Ebv Data Portal. You can see the URL down here. This is a work in progress. It is a storing house for the products, the sort of the geographical information system products. You can imagine data layers, raster maps of EBVs, different types of EBVs, and the geographic scope of, or the extent over which we have those EBVs. So I encourage you to go there and to keep going back to it as it updates. And this is an important part of that collaboration with UNEP-WCMC and others, as we, like the UN Biodiversity Lab, as we begin to build a knowledge base for the Post-2020 framework. Next slide. So let me just linger for a second on our workflow. So where do the EBVs fit in the data to indicators workflow? So starting on the left here, what you see are two types of primary observations. You see the remote sensing information that we can obtain from satellites, but also the many hours of human time spent on the ground making observations in the traditional way, or using new methods and technologies such as environmental DNA, or building on the vast army of citizen science observations that are growing year upon year. And what we do is we integrate these, sometimes via a model that allows us to fill gaps via a statistical inference process from which we can create a distribution map of species and how that map might show change over time and over space. We can take often an ecosystem extent variable directly without passing through a model. And those are our essential biodiversity variable steps. Then we have to integrate the EBVs often into an indicator process, right? And sometimes it takes more than one EBV to create an indicator. That's fine, we can do that integration. And then when we do that, we have a step here, which is absolutely calculating over time or over space progress towards the indicators as defined by the Global Biodiversity Framework. And ideally, what we do is we integrate this with scenarios of change so we can begin to anticipate where we need to go and make more measurements to improve the reliability of our estimates. And all of that is guided by the knowledge need. Next slide. So here is a busy slide that's intended to show you that this EBV workflow is already being used and being taken up. And Mike Gill will speak more to that in a few moments. But this is a case from Colombia, from my partner co-chair, Maria Cecilia Londoño, based at the Humboldt Institute, where they have now developed this workflow, as you can see here, on the species populations EBV. And the idea is to show how we can harmonize this process to create species distribution maps that allow us to assess progress, for example, on species extinction risk assessments or the risk of invasive species, if it's an invasive that's spreading geographically. And they combine the best models and feedback from an expert community that allows them to iteratively improve those models and then validate and publish those indicators, often with a map showing where progress is being made or not being made. So this is now a very practical and applied EBV workflow, and others can take this up. This is scalable and can be applied in any geographic location. Next slide. So I just want to linger for a second on the process of mapping the EBVs to the indicators or the goals and targets of the GBF. So here you're seeing like a layer cake. Right at the bottom, we have these primary data observations. We have to use, in most cases, we have to combine global data sources with national data sources. It's very hard to get relevant information at the national level or subnational level from a global data source. So we have to combine those. And as we pass through this EBV layer, we can create the relevant indicators that then allow us to report progress on a particular headline or component indicator for a given goal. We can think, for example, about progress towards a 30% of protected areas for a given ecosystem type. That's something that's readily available for many indicators and for both national and global data sources. So we've thought through, next slide, this example. And what you see here is a very broad spider's web of a framework where our community, the GEO BON community, has anticipated what's coming now down the lane with the Global Biodiversity Framework. And what we're showing you is how we can go from these data sources through our set of EBVs on up to the proposed and currently being negotiated indicators, and then on up to the various targets of the GBF. And of course, some of those are about just capturing the state of nature, some about thinking about benefits, for example, genetic resources, and others are maybe better applied to thinking about the interventions that we need to apply to improve the status of these indicators. And more will be coming out on this framework very soon. As you can see, this is a document that's in preparation. Next slide. So this is my last slide before I hand over the baton. Next slide, so I can see the rest of the slide. Thank you. And click again. Great, and again. This is we're showing you a map because we are incredibly proud of the momentum we're building around the stitching together of a mosaic of biodiversity observation networks. On the right, you see the map of where bonds have been established quite recently. There are country level bonds like China, Colombia, France, But there are also regional bonds that are impressive in their geographic extent and the coordination and partnerships that are inherent to building a bond at scale. And as I alluded to earlier, we have got these thematic bonds that allow us to take into account change that does not respect national borders. And so the bond, as I said, is the engine of action, and GeoBon is ready to work with parties and partners to establish bonds to do the work of applying the EBV workflow and the indicators that flow from it. So I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to show you some concrete examples of this working.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And hi, everyone. My name is Mike Gill, and I'm the director of the Biodiversity Indicators program at NatureServe. And as Andy mentioned, I was the former co-chair of GeoBon. And in the work that we're doing with many, many different partners, including WCMC on this call, is we're working at the national and regional scale, as Andy mentioned, to build these engines for biodiversity data, or what we call bonds. And the challenge that we face is that when we did some analysis on how parties use indicators in the 5th and 6th national reports, we find, not surprisingly, that there's 11 times more use of national data sets and national indicators than global ones. And that's perfectly fine and as to be expected, because parties trust their own data. They're looking for locally valid results. And sometimes when we disaggregate global data sets, they don't always tell the full picture at the national scale. So the challenge before us is, how do you build piece by piece these different biodiversity observation systems at national, regional, thematic scales, but do so in the way that it's not a mess, and that you actually can scale and integrate data across space and time to say something about progress towards global targets, whether they're the CBDs or sustainable development goals. So the approach that we use, as already mentioned by Andy, is we take a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And the top-down is really applying the concept of the essential biodiversity variables, which are flexible in that they can ingest and convert primary data from different methodologies to say something about things like ecosystem structure and condition and function, species populations, and so forth. And they really build on national data sets. So what we want to do here is not just always say global. Global is incredibly important. We absolutely rely on NASA and ESA and many others on really excellent Earth observation data products, but we also need to invest in national data sources. And the EBV workflow concept is a way that we can actually invest and create a circular, repeated, and sustained process that continually improves and refines the outputs, such as indicators, using both national and global data sources. Next slide, please. So the idea here is that we're actually learning by doing. So we're working here in Ghana. This is a project coordinated by WCMC called Connect. We're working with experts in South Africa's National Biodiversity Institute and Nelson Mandela University, and national experts in Ghana to build these repeatable and sustainable workflows. So we combine in-house, in-country data, such as protected area layers and land cover extent, with global data products such as ESA's CCI to fill gaps, to basically build recipes for biodiversity indicators. And the whole idea here is very simple but powerful. We're really trying to create workflows that demystify the indicator process and show that it's actually not that hard. And a corollary is your kitchen. If you keep flour, sugar, milk, eggs, and butter in your kitchen, you can make a cake, you can make a muffin, you can make cookies. And the same goes for biodiversity data. We're finding through the application of working at the national scale that there are some core data sets that can be repurposed and built on and integrated in different ways to produce things like Goal A, Target 2 indicators for tracking those targets, Sustainable Development Goals indicators, and also building on the UN SEEA process by actually updating and building on natural capital accounts. Next slide, please. And this is just an example from South Africa, South Africa's National Biodiversity Institute and Nelson Mandela University, who have worked with WCMC on something called the Spatial Biodiversity Assessment. And this is a very simple but powerful workflow process that actually does follow the EBV concepts. We are integrating things like land cover time series, protected areas data from the WDPA, land use and condition, and vegetation maps to produce a very simple but powerful spatial assessment that can be used for things like environmental impact assessment, sustainable development goals, and tracking the post-2020 targets. So we can use spatial biodiversity assessments, and we are using them not just in South Africa, but in Malawi, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Uganda, and elsewhere, to build repeatable workflows that strengthen national data and integrate it with global data sources to produce multiple outputs. Next slide, please. And this is just an example from Uganda showing the spatial outputs of a spatial biodiversity assessment, where you can look at the ecosystem threat status against a baseline of original ecosystem extent to basically prioritize things like restoration and conservation action that directly feeds into our 2030 goals under the SDGs and the post-2020 target. But we're also using the outputs of that data to strengthen Uganda's natural capital account. So you're sort of killing several birds with one stone, which of course I shouldn't use that analogy. Next slide, please. And this is just an example that it's not just spatial. This puts together baseline assessments of things like ecosystem threat status. So what are the most threatened ecosystems at the national scale using red list of ecosystem criteria that you can then create time series indicators for by revisiting and repeating that assessment over time. And what you'll hear in future webinars as part of this series is ways to actually do that using different EBV classes, such as species, population, and ecosystem structure. And we're working to see how we can apply these at the national scale to do that. Next slide. And just finally, just showing some EBV-based indicators. This is from CSIRO in Australia, where you can actually visualize those spatially as well as in chart form at a regional scale, across borders, between countries, and within watersheds to actually look at progress towards different targets. And that's the whole goal here. This is an example of a NatureServe biodiversity dashboard that we produced in Southeast Asia, but the same holds true for all the EBV-based indicators that actually can be visualized spatially and in chart form, and can be brought into things like the target tracker, for instance, and the UN Biodiversity Lab. So with that, I'll pass it back to Andy.
Thank you, Mike. Just a very quick wrap up. To say that the Secretariat of GEO BON has moved to Montreal, Canada, where our goal, of course, is to catalyze all these partnerships that you're seeing the logos of on this global network. And I want to say, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you would like to know more about the ideas and the framework that Mike and I have told you about today. Next slide. And I'll just close to say that this is just a first dip into this ocean of essential biodiversity variables and indicators. We intend, as you can see on this slide, to deliver a number of future webinars on different features or facets of biodiversity. You can see here EBVs on July 12th on species populations and area-based conservation. There'll be one on genetic diversity on July 26th. And then another one that'll be given by SEEA, led by SEEA on Aries, GEP, gross ecosystem product on August 18th. And then dates TBD to be decided on ecosystem integrity and extent and connectivity, led by GEO BON. And then in October, tools for national reporting that will be led by UNEP-WCMC. So stay tuned, there's much more to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So with this, we are now finishing this quite interesting, but also quite rich series of presentations. Now, I would like to have a little bit of time, even if it's a bit less than foreseen, for questions. And so I already see a question from the participants. And I will ask especially Alessandra Alfieri and our colleague from GEO BON. So how does the SEEA initiative link to the GEO BON initiative? What is the relationship of the EBVs and the bonds from GEO BON and the SEEA framework, and how they can be integrated to support the compilation of indicators for the Global Biodiversity Monitoring framework. So I don't know if Alessandra or Andrew or Mike, who wants to respond to that quickly? Thank you.
Well, I can jump in, but I'm sure Alessandra will have more to say about this. Well, I think we're doing this both theoretically and in practice. I see a lot of connections between essential biodiversity variables and the work that we're doing on the national scale to feed ecosystem accounts. So both as Alessandra already mentioned, there's the publication of chapters 1 to 7 of the ecosystem accounts under SEEA. And GEO BON representatives have also been active participants in chapter 12 around the indicators. And what we're finding, and again, maybe I can draw on some of the examples from Uganda and Ghana, is that we're not just working, GEO BON anyways, is not just working with the Ministry of Environments and some of the more classic biodiversity institutes, but we also work with the statistical services or the national statistics offices. And so when we produce something like a spatial biodiversity assessment, which might be something that can serve tracking of goal A target 2, you're also producing ecosystem condition, extent maps and data that can actually strengthen or form the basis for the beginning of a natural capital account under SEEA. I'm sure Alessandra can say way more on that than me.
Alessandra, before you respond, I would like then to link that to another question, which is you refer to some documentation note that you intend to, I mean, the statistic division intends to provide in view of the open-ended working group 3 meeting. And so there is a question about if there will be a document describing the monitored indicators in detail published by the statistics division. So I guess that's related to this documentation. So Alessandra?
Yes, no, thank you. And I mean, I think Mike said it very well. I think that these initiatives are very much complementary because, I mean, our objective is really to compile the accounts, but to compile the accounts, we need to have the basic data that can be basically used for the accounting purposes. And I think what we are trying to work on is that the data that is being developed and that the EBV are consistent with the definition and classifications of the SEEA EA. And we have already done this kind of assessment and bridging between the EBVs and the SEEA ecosystem accounts. So at the global level, I think that the idea is really to have this the variables consistent with the SEEA accounts, so that once they are generated, that can be used directly for the compilation of the accounts. And at the country level, what Mike has mentioned, I mean, is really working together in bringing all the stakeholders together. So yes, it's the national statistical offices, but it is also the mapping agencies and the Ministry of Environment and so on. So I think that we are all working within this multi-stakeholders environment, and I think we can benefit from each other's particularly entry point, because our entry point is usually the National Statistical Office, but the National Statistical Office doesn't really have this expertise to compile these biodiversity variables and developing this information system on biodiversity, so they can actually leverage this information that is being generated for the compilation of the accounts. So we very much look forward on working together on this. And also for the areas for SEEA, the idea is to use this data that is being developed by GEO BON and integrated it into the areas for SEEA Explorer to be able to compile this, the accounts. In terms of the publication, what next with the development of this paper, I think we have a group, an indicator group, which was established as part of the SEEA EA revision process, and we have decided actually to continue to keep this group and to support the monitoring framework. And one of the, and this is not only a group of statisticians, actually, it includes people also, I mean, including the GEO BON people, the IUCN and JRC. So those that have been heavily involved in the drafting and revision of the SEA ecosystem accounts are also supporting the development of this document for the open-ended working group. It will be, I mean, we haven't decided whether this would actually be a statistics division document or it will be a UNCEA document, which reflects more this intergovernmental process that will actually produce this document. But I mean, it is definitely not a collaborative effort. It's not only the statistics division developing it.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Jillian. Of course, it's for parties to decide how you know, the reporting, the monitoring framework will be developed and who will be in the technical expert group. But there is a question about the role of national statistics offices for the national reporting landscape, and especially the national reporting under the CBD. Jillian.
Thank you. The idea behind the national reporting process is that it really should be a whole of government effort to report anyway. So I think that as we're moving forward, or looking back, many of the national reports really were developed by particular ministries. But looking forward, I think that this is a real opportunity to bring in additional stakeholders. And this is something that the parties have certainly recognized in the process, that the people who are involved in the Biodiversity Convention are looking to bring in additional stakeholders and to make biodiversity something that is more of a whole of government approach. And I think, unfortunately, right now, you know, it really will be up to each individual country to determine how they want this coordination to work and how they promote coordination between the statistical office and those that are directly involved in the biodiversity processes. However, I think there's, from what I've witnessed, there's a willingness in most countries, and additionally, without the involvement of the National Statistical Office, I think it's going to be a real challenge to operationalize the monitoring framework. And I think this is something that's widely realized, and this is one of the reasons why we're having this webinar and this series of webinars, is to try to describe how this works and to try to outline what that role could be, because of the fact that the NSOs are the holders of the data. And so I'm not sure if that fully answered the question, but basically we see the tremendous need for coordination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have now questions to Natasha and also Andrew and Mike. There are different tools and data sets that exist for the compilation of indicators. Could you share if there is any work plan from your organization network to support the interoperability of data and models for the Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework? So now we are going to the tools that Natasha, you quickly presented at the end of your presentation, but you said there will be more information in the months to come. And it's also related to what our colleague from GEO BON presented. So all the machinery necessary to provide good indicators and all the traceability and methodology behind. So Natasha, you want to start?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. We're really working on this behind the scenes. So there are a big range a wide range of platforms under development. And it's important that we work to try and find alignment and complementarity between those, so that it's not confusing for parties, I think, in terms of which platforms to use. The follow-up session on this, on tools to be held in October, will outline each of those platforms that we're working on collaboratively and describe how they can be used for monitoring and reporting. But as Mike highlighted in his presentation, we're certainly working on the national dashboard side to integrate that information into the target tracker closely with UN Biodiversity Labs to integrate the global indicators that we'll showcase in the target tracker into UN Biodiversity Labs so that parties can download those indicators and use them in their national reports. Similarly, we're working with the EU Joint Research Centre on their Knowledge Centre platform to integrate the information to the EU level, and likewise we'll do the same across the different platforms. So it's definitely work in progress. I can show on our next set of webinars, I can show how that interoperability might work a bit more detail.
Thank you, Natasha. Very relevant indeed. Andrew, in terms of, I mean, you showed some country bonds, but yeah, if you want to add.
Please, thank you, Anne. Yes, indeed, there are two levels. There is the national level, and maybe Mike is best placed to speak to that. I'm currently engaged in trying to set up a Canada bond, and this is very much the issue, is how do you select and identify the best tools? There are so many out there. So at the global level, we showed you, for example, an Ebv portal, the development of the access to the Ebv data that's required. But there are also a set of standardized model and statistical methods for turning an Ebv into an indicator. And so what we're doing right now is heavily investing in what we're calling BON in a box. And BON in a box is essentially a one-stop shop, if you like, for not only capacity building, but for identifying the information you need to establish a BON. And from there, if help is needed, to kickstart the process of generating these EBVs and indicators for your region. So over the next 18 months, we will be setting up BON in a box so that is available to all. And the last thing I will mention is that GeoBon is creating a new mode of working. It's called a knowledge hub. And the knowledge hub is designed to foster capacity building. It's user-driven and engages different GeoBon members around the collective goal of helping parties, partners, establish their own workflow using some of the best practices that GeoBon is promoting. Mike, do you want to speak to some of that at the national level?
Well, sure. I'll just quickly add, because there's probably other questions to cover, but I think Natasha said it well, that there's lots of different platforms out there and there's a lot of confusion. But UNEP-WCMC, sort of who sits at a nexus on a lot of this, is sort of working to sort of create a more coherent picture. And I think some of it is just simply a communication challenge. These platforms do offer different use case outputs. But if you're looking from the outside in, it's sometimes confusing. But one thing that they do have in common is they're sort of ingesting or harvesting a lot of the same biodiversity data layers. And the big challenge we have is that, as we all know, biodiversity data is hard to fund. It's limited in space and taxonomic classification, all that. And it's much easier to get funding for a new platform. And so what we're trying to also do with this workflow approach is really remind everyone that if you want to be able to guide progress, effective progress to a target, you don't just need a great platform and a really nice indicator, but you actually need the core ingredients to be invested in to build those indicators. I think that's where we've got to put at least more effort into that sort of foundational piece so that all these platforms that already do great things can work even better. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm also happy to say that in the European Union, we have launched Europa Bond, which is, we hope, the regional brother or sister of GeoBon. And there we are really calling for linking up, connecting public authorities with citizen science, linking in situ monitoring with artificial intelligence and remote sensing, business, to really try to build something big and something robust and invest in monitoring in the years to come. And Horizon Europe, which is the new research program, has put monitoring of biodiversity high on the agenda, and quite substantial funding is booked for that. And don't forget that Horizon Europe is open to the whole world, so it's not only for EU countries to apply. Then they maybe to finish quickly, so there are also questions about SEEA and climate change, whether the biodiversity is linked to the framework of environment statistics, and the draft global framework on climate change indicators and statistics, and where some biodiversity selected biodiversity indicators somehow are included. So I guess it's all about what Jillian said before, this whole government reporting, where we will really try not only to have a whole government reporting, but also whole government monitoring, in order to interlink different monitoring frameworks for climate, for biodiversity, as well as for other policy areas. It's very important because the land use will be impacted by climate change, but will also have a role to play, especially as carbon sequestration, carbon sinks. And so we have to make sure that we are working hand in hand, and the monitoring framework of the Global Biodiversity Framework has a few hooks for really engaging a conversation with UNFCCC. And UK, I think the presidency of UNFCCC COP is really calling for a nature COP. So we hope that with all these high political commitment, that we will really be able to improve the coordination between these policy areas. Time is flying, so I would like to give the floor to each of you to say a final word before we close the meeting. So I'll go in the same order and start with Jillian, followed by Alessandra, Natasha, and then Andrew and Mike. So Jillian, you have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to thank everyone for coming. And my final statement is that, as mentioned before, coordination and collaboration is what is really going to be important here. And I do feel that monitoring of biodiversity and tracking our progress is the only way that we're going to see a true change. And so we really do all need to work together so that we can have a better handle on what the world looks like and develop the policies that we need and the actions that we need in order to take us in the right direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Jillian. Alessandra?
Yes, I would like very much to echo what Jillian said, that this idea of working in a multi-stakeholder framework and working together is really at the heart. I mean, it's a challenge, but also an opportunity to try to build on the expertise of the different communities. And I think that basically the SEEA is just an organizing framework for all these initiatives that are going on, and trying to, using the accounting approach to bring and to establish these linkages and bringing all this information together. And this applies both to the biodiversity and to the climate change and to the land degradation. So it's the bringing together all this information that is being generated, be it from the Framework for the Development of Environment Statistics, GEO BON, or all the data sources, in a way that it can be actually linked to official statistics, so economic statistics and social statistics as well. That's really the strength of the system.
Thank you, Alessandra. Natasha?
Thanks. So I'll echo what the others have said. Thank you so much to those who have attended this session. And in the spirit of collaboration, I think it's on us and some of us organisations to work together to build capacity around the identification and use and application of these indicators. So I think what we've done in this session and planned in the future sessions is to provide information on the landscape of the available indicators and tools even that are available to assist parties with monitoring and reporting. But what we must do really is work together to build capacity in those countries to interpret the information that is being used in these different mechanisms, platforms and tools. So I think that's an important next step for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Natasha. Andrew?
Thank you indeed. A huge thank you to all of you for coming and to the organizers. It's incredibly encouraging to see so many people on this call. That's what sustains and nourishes this effort. And we know that this kind of collaboration that you're seeing here is the way forward. It's the only way forward. The task is too great and the time span too short for us not to do this through community and network approaches. I encourage you all to come to the next webinar series where you'll see some incredible researchers and practitioners sharing not only the methodologies, but how they're being implemented.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks everyone for joining. I guess, you know, the failure over the last 10 years is of course a failure, but I think what's encouraging is we've learned a lot. And I think the draft monitoring framework is a huge step forward in how we're looking at tracking and guiding progress going forward. And we have a lot of the recipes in place with SEEA and the work at WCMC and GEO BON. I guess the only other thing I would say is that it's not really just about us sort of telling people what to do, but it's really about creating a process by which innovations that are happening at the national scale get transferred. So everyone's basically more or less facing a lot of the same problems. And there's a lot of people out there at the national level in Colombia and South Africa, Mexico, and elsewhere that are coming up with some excellent methodologies and indicators. And we have to sort of allow the process to surface those as well. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you all. I would like also on my behalf to thank the organizers of this webinar. I was very honored to be invited to facilitate the workshop, and I would like to thank all the participants, because indeed there were many participants who attended. I know it's frustrating because we have very little time for questions, but as you heard, it's only the beginning of something. It's not the end, and I'm sure we will have other opportunities to go deeper into the substance. So thank you very much and see you soon. Bye-bye.